Hey, Adam Hooksmer here from ProjectionHub, and in this video I'm going to answer the question whether an owner's salary should be considered an add back in a small business acquisition. And so my background, I was an SBA lender for 12 years, made over 1,500 SBA loans during my time as a lender, and worked on quite a few acquisition deals. One of the common questions that we get, and really thinking through how financing an acquisition can work with an SBA lender and how the SBA is going to look at a deal versus how you might think about a deal in terms of a valuation, this question of the seller's compensation, the owner compensation for the seller, and should that be considered an add back or not. So let me kind of dive into the details of how we think about this and how your SBA lender is probably going to be thinking about this. I'm going to be pulling up our acquisition projection template just as a tool to kind of use as I'm explaining this and show you why this matters and how it impacts the projections and really impacts your SBA loan request as well. So I'm going to also put a link in the description of the video below to this acquisition projection template in case you find it useful. You can grab that and follow along as well. Okay, so we're going to start by looking here on the at a glance tab and looking at the debt service coverage ratio. So your SBA lender is going to want to make sure that your debt service coverage ratio is 1.25 or above. And what that means is that you have $1.25 of earnings for every dollar of loan payments or debt service that you have. And so in this example right now, based on the data that I have in there, we're at 2.48. So we're over double or right around double that requirement. So we've got almost $2.50 for every dollar of debt service. So in really good shape here from a cash flow perspective. But the concept of whether you're adding back the salary has an implication here, because from a valuation standpoint, what often happens, come to this historic data tab. So from a valuation standpoint, the business is often valued based on a multiple of SDE or seller's discretionary earnings. And so in our template here, we put in the historical revenue and the historical expenses, and then we have this little add back section. And so what your seller is probably going to do, or the business broker that's working with the seller, they're probably going to add back the seller's salary and increase the seller's discretionary earnings. So for example, you've got the owner's salary here as an expense, $150,000, and so that 150,000 is decreasing the net income of the business, right? So we had 306,400 as net income last year, but once we add back the 150,000 owner salary here, you've got a seller's discretionary earnings of 456. So a lot of times the seller wants to value the business based on a multiple of this 456 instead of a multiple of the 306. So question here though is, what will the SBA lender consider? Will they consider adding back the seller salary or not? So the way the SBA is probably going to look at this is they want you to make sure that you have a reasonable salary for whatever the work that needs to be done to keep the business operating as normal. So if this seller was highly involved in the business, in order to replace the seller, you would need to hire someone that cost $150,000 or perhaps even more. Let's say you'd have to hire somebody to replace them and pay them $150,000, then the SBA lender is going to say, no, you can't add that back. You wouldn't get to include that as an add back from the SBA and cash flow projection perspective. And so where that comes into play here on our projections is on the expense input tab. Now I have a CEO salary. So let's say you're going to hire an outside CEO. Maybe the SBA lender says, okay, we think you can find someone to replace the seller for $125,000. So effectively you're adding back $25,000 of the seller's expense, right? So when you do that in the projections, that is ultimately going to, flow through the operating expenses and kind of be included in this debt service coverage ratio. Now, for example, if we were to say what you might initially want to do or be tempted to do is say, we don't even need the CEO salary, and so we're kind of just excluding that seller's compensation altogether. When you do that, what ends up happening is that debt service coverage ratio goes up really high. And so the temptation then is to say, well, the business can afford to take on more debt, meaning we can pay a higher price for the business. And so if you're trying to kind of thread the needle and get the highest price and the highest amount of debt from the SBA, they're going to look at that and say, well, you don't have any compensation in there to kind of replace what the seller was doing, and we think you're going to need somebody there. So they're going to want to include that seller's expense going forward. So when you do that in this scenario, it still cash flows. But let's say in this scenario, this seller is working like crazy and they're actually doing the work of two people. And so in order to replace the seller, you're actually going to need to hire two people, maybe each at $100,000. And so you're actually going to have, the SBA lender might say, you actually should have $200,000 in expense because the seller hasn't been paying themselves enough. So when you do that, well, now we bring our debt service coverage ratio down even lower. So now we're getting a little bit closer to that 1.25 number. So I just want to be clear here that there's a difference between what can be considered an add back from a valuation perspective and what you're willing to pay for a business from a seller's discretionary earnings perspective, and what an SBA lender is going to be willing to consider an add back as it relates to calculating that projected debt service coverage ratio. So hope that's been helpful. If you have questions about that, feel free to reach out, support@ProjectionHub.com. You can email us there and ask your questions. We're here to help. If you found this video to be helpful, I'd love it if you like and subscribe to our channel. We're trying to produce content that's helpful for folks that are trying to get an SBA loan, folks that are trying to create projections or business plans for acquisitions and have specific questions on this topic. So we hope this has been helpful, and we hope you'll help us spread the word. All right, thanks.